Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast. I'm Jim Henson, Director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. Happy to be joined by Josh Blank, the Research Director for the Texas Politics Project. How are we this morning, Josh?
Doing pretty well. It's a little sticky today, a little hot.
Well, I was just going to say, you seem relatively well appointed given the you-know-what.
It's funny. It's like, when we record these things in the summer, I like to embrace the summer, so I might be wearing shorts. There might be sandals. But then once the kids come back and they're on campus and I work here, I feel like, I should put on some pants.
Got to be presentable. So in other words, you're saying your legs are a little clammy.
My legs are covered.
Covered and a little clammy.
My toes are in socks. Yeah, there's all kinds of things. Anyway, that's not very interesting. This is not what you came for this podcast. My sartorial choices.
Well, who knows what people come to this podcast for? I think we have a pretty good sense of what our niche audience is. So we're recording on Tuesday, August 22nd, as Josh implied, day after school starts at the University of Texas at Austin. And for some reason, there's a student listening. Welcome back. And the trial of suspended Attorney General Ken Paxton is set to begin 2 weeks from today.
Countdown.
It's getting close. On September 5th, the day after Labor Day. And I've thought about this, another stray thought, in a podcast intro of stray thoughts, it's going to really ruin a lot of people's Labor Day this year.
I suppose that's
not
true.
A lot, but, I kind of doubt a lot of the senators are going to take one last Labor Day jaunt, although who knows?
You don't think so?
Since we last podcasted about a week ago, we've had kind of an avalanche of new information, some of which was released actually the day we recorded last week, and a few notable developments in the filings for the trial. So to kind of set what we want to talk about, and we're going to wind up talking a bit about a post we did on the Texas Politics Project very recently that we'll point people to. So what have we seen? In the case, the House managers, essentially the prosecution in the impeachment trial, filed a bucket of pretty hard-hitting responses to Paxton's motions that had been filed by his defense team a couple of weeks ago. And we talked about the defense motions on the podcast a couple weeks ago when we were lucky enough to have Lauren Magai on the podcast, and that was right after they had been made public. And we're going to get back to one aspect of the back and forth that we wrote the post about that was based on all that. But in the last week since we last recorded, the House managers dropped a pretty big bomb that was the focus of almost all of the attention in the case over the weekend, and that was a tranche of some 4,000 pages of evidentiary exhibits that have, for the most part, really driven coverage of the case, certainly in the Texas press since they were released last Thursday night. The highlights are all in the coverage. For listeners here, you said, it's interesting to go and start kind of going through all those filings, though. It's a lot of documents. I mean, I was feeling, frankly, a little bitchy that I had to read, 250 pages of briefs, overnight last week when the House managers released their responses. Then I'm glad they waited a few days to release all of this. But, some of the things that people will have seen in the news is, for example, the Excel spreadsheet of the Uber rides that were, with the data from those rides, times, places, from the sort of crypto Uber account that the Attorney General appears to have been sharing with Nate Paul, and lots of other things that, there's an interesting diagram. This got a little less play, but I thought was interesting. There's an interesting diagram of all of Nate Paul's LLCs that were used to kind of construct his business dealing, and there are a lot of them. It looks like a UT org chart.
Right. I mean, that's the thing. I mean, the 4,000 pages or so, it's interesting because there's there's these two things that kind of come out of it, right? One is sort of the thing that is really driving the coverage, which is like burner phones and, secret, Lyft, secret Uber accounts and how many times Paxton seems to allege to have visited his mistress, throughout this. And to some extent, I think, to me, actually, a lot of this stuff was already really been alleged. I mean, I don't think there's a lot of new information, but it does like detail in a lot of ways the lengths that they both went to try to kind of cover their tracks a little bit more clearly.
In a number of different settings.
And so there's sort of that piece of it, which is, a direct response to this idea, well, the House has no evidence. And it's like, well, okay, hold on a second. Here's all this stuff that we've been talking about and we've said it turns out we weren't lying. In the committees, this is data that we have about this. And then there's all the legal arguments also, which is about how this case should proceed and all that stuff, which is getting a lot less coverage because, frankly, it's just more complicated. I mean, in some ways. So, I mean, it is true that, you kind of go and look at this coverage and what really came out was like, burner phones and stuff like that. But I think, for us, in some ways, the sort of intersection of the reception of sort of the facts of the case on the one hand as they become more and more clear to people, what did and did not occur, but then the intersection with sort of these legal arguments all kind of falling under this political umbrella makes for kind of what you and I are probably most interested in.
Well, I mean, there are a lot of very interesting, affidavits of accounts of meetings, things that took place between various actors as, in various phases of this. And it's a pretty deep, it's not just a rabbit hole; it's a warren. It's a warren of, I can't remember what you call a group of rabbits, but there's a lot of tunnels here to be burrowing into. So there were also a lot of developments, if you will, kind of away from the ball, as it were, away from the back and forth between the litigants, and we are going to get back to some of that. So, some of those that were also interesting in terms of, again, as you say, the political context of the case and, the drum we've been beating a little bit in here, I think, and about the political nature of this process. And there was a line in one of the filings by the House managers in response to the defense manager that, refer this as, capital P political. Yeah. Right, in terms of the nature of this. Now, that was a little bit of a play on the Federalist Papers, but, be that as it may, I like the point. So, but some of these developments. So, late last week, Lieutenant Governor Patrick appointed Mark Brown, who had served as a judge on the 14th Court of Appeals in the middle of the decade, had done a lot of legal work, pretty much a known Republican, I think it's fair to say, more or less, had appointed Brown to serve as his legal counsel in the trial. And people remember that the rules allow since he helped write the rules, invite the lieutenant governor to hire somebody to serve his legal counsel as he presides over the trial. And there's some precedent for this in past impeachments. So this is a big story for a day or so. The next day, Judge Brown sent the lieutenant governor a letter declining to accept the invitation to serve this role. It's been reported that Patrick's staff met with Brown, presumably as part of a vetting process. I think it's not too much of a reach to think that, to discuss what, I think a Tribune, or actually it was a Dallas Morning News story, I believe, quoting the letter from Brown, to discuss any political activities and relationships to the participants in, quote unquote, in l'affaire Paxton. Brown said he had no recollection of any matters, I think, at that time, but apparently on Saturday he, quote unquote, remembered that he and his wife had contributed $250 to the Eva Guzman campaign in November 2021 during her unsuccessful primary challenge to then incumbent A.G. Paxton. Right. Critics were skeptical, on both sides about what was going on here. But it appears that Lieutenant Governor Patrick is still searching for an advisor now. I mean, I was thinking, I wonder what Wallace Jefferson is up to, but my guess is Wallace Jefferson probably gave more than $250. I don't know. We need to do some due diligence on that.
That's disqualifying. I mean,
so we'll have to look. So then also in another, development kind of, in the broader halo of the trial, Paxton's main, or at least most visible lawyer, the sort of increasingly well-known Tony Busby, announced that he's going to run for a Houston City Council seat. Now, Busby previously ran for mayor against Sylvester Turner and lost. And this, of course, has drawn all kinds of discussion about how Busby might implicitly or explicitly use the trial as more of a forum than he already has for his public profiling with his political ambition in Houston.
I think that's like the clear and obvious sort of question to read, although there is part of me when reading that was sort of thinking to myself about what kind of, potential latitude he might give himself or claim as a candidate. Because, in the context of the gag order going on in the trial right now, yes, that exists. But there's also, a First Amendment protection, especially for political speech. So as an actual active, candidate for office, and again, look, I'm not trying to say I know what Tony Busby is thinking, because that's impossible for me to know.
Right.
But it does, and I do think, whatever, he's as sincerely as he's running for anything, he's running for the seat, sure. But I do think it's kind of interesting. He's in this position where on the one hand, he's dealing with one of the biggest sort of political dramas, of the state in real time, and at the same time, he's going to be running for office where presumably, he's still not supposed to talk about any of what he's doing over here, where he's actually going to be known. So it's kind of, it's just an interesting sort of,
the dynamic there
is very curious.
Very interesting for those, I can't remember what place it is, but he's running for a council seat, kind of West University, River Oaks, I think, or West University, I think. And I'll leave the details of that to the Houston people. So step back from all this. If you're keeping score at home, Tony Busby will be defending Ken Paxton while running for a Houston City Council seat. And while it's been a story, seems okay. Nobody's saying, hey, you can't do that or you shouldn't do that. Or, I'm sure there's some people saying he shouldn't, but nobody in the process.
It doesn't seem to be changing what's happening.
Right. So that's okay. Busby running for Ken Paxton's campaign owes Lieutenant Governor and presiding officer of the trial, Dan Patrick's campaign, $125,000 from a campaign loan. These things happen, in the course of campaign. That's okay. No Senator Angela Paxton's campaign owes the defendant's campaign, that is, suspended Attorney General Paxton, who is her husband, $600,000, also a campaign loan. She doesn't have a vote, but will still be counted as part of the jury in the denominator in the votes on motion. The others are voting on for motions and conviction or acquittal. That's more or less okay, apparently. Now, they've tweaked that a little bit, and, word on the street is that was, a very contentious issue in the Senate caucus meeting prior to the adoption of the rules, but still more or less okay. On the non-financial side, the Attorney General recruited a state senator, Brian Hughes, to request a legal opinion that helped avoid foreclosure on the properties owned by Paul that were up for auction and owned by Paul and for his businesses.
Subject of one of the impeachment charges.
One of the impeachment charges, and that was one of the things that was fleshed out in some of these counter filings and some of these documents that were dumped. And there was a little note in there that, I noticed there was a line that said that Hughes did not know what this was pertaining to, that this was connected to Paul. So Hughes remaining a juror, though, okay.
Sure, I guess so.
Back in the financial lane, the Defend Texas Liberty PAC, which has been a leading defender of Paxton, donated $1 million to Lieutenant Governor Patrick's campaign, and then loaned it another $2 million. And the timing of this $3 million these $3 million in total transactions was in June after the House impeached Paxton. That too seems to be okay.
Right.
No recusals or, some bad press about it, but nothing.
Just a couple million.
And then Judge Mark Brown gave Eva Guzman $250 during the 2021 primary. That's not okay. Now, I'm going to be a little bit disingenuous. I wish I could clarify why this all makes sense in this moment. I'm not sure that I can, other than a general characterizations of the process. So, for now, we'll file this portion of the podcast under the Keeping Up with the Trial, put it in the Keeping Up with the Trial column, and we'll circle back maybe a little bit on what to make of this. But, you and I have talked about this a lot, and it's the subject and it's also a legal subject now of the filings that, it's important to keep in mind this is not your normal, I don't even want to say normal, it's not a legal trial per se.
Yeah, I mean, I think the way you laid that out, it really, for anyone who is sort of, whether they're part of the process or just watching the process, who wants to say, okay, what ideal type is this? What is this and how? I mean, I think what's been going on a lot is this idea, well, this is a criminal proceeding and here's the way that it's deviating. This is mostly what's coming out of from Paxton's camp, is saying this is a criminal proceeding and therefore it needs to meet all these thresholds and benchmarks. But I think what you just laid out is a really clear point here, which is, this is not a normal trial, right? All of the participants, the defendant, the prosecution, the judge, and the jury have connections to each other because they're all responsible to the same people, both voters and donors and each other in a lot of cases, right? And so, to complain or to pretend otherwise or to ask for a process that should look certain, it's just that doesn't exist here. All of those sort of baseline assumptions about how this process works, a dispassionate judge who has no connection to the case, jurors who are a juror of your peers, which I mean, maybe these are jurors of his peers, I suppose, but who have no prejudice.
That's the thing that's actually closest.
Yeah, it's the closest,
but in a much narrower sense than we're used to it.
But also an unbiased jury of your peers, right? I mean, this is just not something that exists. But I think there's another way to look at this too, which I think is important, because there's a lot of sort of, rock throwing from the cheap seats or whatever, which is that to say, there's no simple rule or code of conduct that's going to somehow make this work in a way that's going to look like a jury trial that doesn't disqualify half or more of the participants, or just basically acquits Paxton and says, hey, we can't deal with this because we're all so, entangled in it.
Yeah. And I mean, I guess I want to, underline a couple points out of that. One is, as we've gotten closer to the trial, and we're going through the pre-trial motions and all of this, it is becoming clear that observation in terms of the contention between the two sides, is taking on kind of a political, or not political, it's taking on a political, but it's also taking on, it's mapping on to the adversarial roles of the two parties in an interesting way. In that, if you do go through and you read all those motions, as you kind of referred to, Paxton's defense is trying to get for their client the most robust protections that exist given the Texas and federal constitutions in the criminal justice system and in the judicial process. Understandable. A large part of the response to those motions by the House managers and their lawyers was to say, yeah, that's not what this is. Right, which is kind of the point we've been making all along. But, I guess the point I'm making is we've been making that point for a while, but in a very different kind of context. And I just do want to flag that when you make that point now, I think we've had the luxury a little bit of making it from, you said the cheap seats, and if I was going to be really beat us up about it, I'd say that. But, from a different perspective, right? And now these arguments are really entering into the adversarial process in a way that, I suppose I should have anticipated, but I hadn't really thought through that this would be so front and center. I mean, one of the filings in particular, goes to the well. I was on a panel with some academics for a Tribune event a couple of months ago, and we were joking about they take away our political scientist cards if we didn't mention the Federalist Papers. Well, Federalist Papers loomed pretty large, and the recourse to the understanding of the political nature of the process in the Constitution and in the Federalist Papers looms very large in all this, and was a big part of at least one of the pleadings.
Yeah, and I think the thing that I want to take away from this, I mean, you and I, what I think, at least I pride myself on in a lot of ways in terms of, what I can contribute here. And I think what we do a lot of contributing is sort of trying to provide context and sort out these sort of different signals that are flowing around and try to make sense of it. And, I think to your point, you kind of said before, you'd like to clarify, but, and it's like, this is not something where you can easily kind of line up the arguments on one side, line up the other and say, well, these guys are arguing this and these guys are arguing that. And therefore, this is where it's not like that. I mean, this is such a complicated space. And part of it is the quasi-judicial, quasi-political nature of it means that, you have, in some sense, one side making a set of arguments under one set of circumstances while making another set of arguments in another set of circumstances. And in some way, you kind of combine them together and say, well, those don't go together. So, for example, the idea here is, to your point, and I think, look, this is, there's no judgment here. I think this is what you imagine in any sort of judicial process in the U.S. is a very, well-defended, well-prosecuted adversarial system. Paxton's lawyers should mount every possible argument that is available to them to help their client, just as, the House impeachment managers and their lawyers should, basically try to get the best and most favorable set of circumstances for their case. That's just what is going on right now. It's not common.
Yeah.
I think for outsiders to watch this, even in the judicial system, like under a regular set of, unless
you're a regular watcher of Law and Order, the classic.
The classic Law and Order. Yeah, maybe the classic. But even though I don't think the classic Law and Order is like, okay, pretrial motion phase, And so, on the one hand, you have this idea that, they're saying, well, this is a criminal trial, this is what it should look like. He shouldn't have to be cross-examined. There's all these sort of pieces. And on the other hand, they're also kind of making this argument, Paxton lawyers, that like, look, the voters already forgave him. Right? There's this other side of this, which is say, as a political matter, this is settled, actually. And that's actually another big part of this. And so it's kind of interesting in some sense. So, and I'm not saying that as a ding against them, because what I'm actually said before that was like they should pursue every avenue and argument. But if it doesn't seem like there's a lot of consistency within.
Yeah. Well, I think part of the issue here is that, and I think, we don't have to beat this to death, but what serves their client best right now, if you're Ken Paxton and his lawyers, is to strive for more legalism and to portray this as more of a legal process than, frankly, just to be clear, than it is.
Yeah, and I would say this too is that, and that argument can actually serve both the legal and the political, right? So in this case, a lot of the, if you think about when Paxton was impeached, and you think about what a lot of his defenders were saying, of which there weren't a ton, but among the defenders, what they would say is they were pointing to the process. In most cases, they were not defending his conduct. They were not saying, the allegations against him were untrue or unfounded. They were saying the process that led to this was suspect. Right. And so in some ways, part of this is to say, look, we want to give our client every protection we possibly can as if he was a criminal defendant in a normal trial. But also by laying out the idea that somehow this trial is not meeting this, sort of somewhat arbitrary, set of standards that they've set up, furthers the political argument that, he's being railroaded, that the House is, run by a bunch of Democrats, which is part of this, this kind of, which I think is one of the more crazy arguments out
Democrats and rhinos.
Democrats and rhinos, right? And that therefore, ultimately, but that pressure, I think the goal in some ways is for that pressure to get back around to the jurors so that they hear from their voters, well, this process is messed up.
Well, yeah, and that raises the point that we've talked about a bit, that, these pages and pages and pages of briefs are also, and motions are also serving the purpose of doing what they're both sides are prohibited from doing by the gag order. So,
yeah, and Tony Buzbee has been really the best about this. Partially, there's an asymmetry here, which I think is important. There's a lot of people spending money sort of on Paxton's behalf or on his, in his public defense, in terms of regular players in Texas politics. There's not like a big tranche of money floating around of, the people who want to prosecute Paxton making the counter argument. So you've got sort of the combination of that. Paxton's lawyers can't just go out and make, broad-based claims about, how nefarious the House is, but they can put in a filing and then read it.
Sure.
And so we're going to see a lot of that.
Right. And know that there are, parallel organizations doing that for them anyway.
Exactly.
Right, to be fair. So you gave us a good hook for a transition, and then we went on anyway. But, in a post this week, we used one of the arguments between...
The hook's still there, which is this is still a public strategy, hidden in all this legalism.
In a post this week, we used one of the arguments between the House managers and Paxton in the motions filed before the impeachment court as a pointed departure, an invitation maybe is a little more accurate, to round up results from, wait for it, our polling on the Attorney General and his legal, ethical, and political troubles. Now, threaded through several of the filings was the attempt by the Paxton defense to invoke fairly obscure and overlapping Texas legal doctrines known as the prior term and the forgiveness doctrine. Now, we do a lot of explaining in the piece, but the short version is that the defense, or shortish, is that the defense moved to dismiss most of the charges against Paxton by claiming that there was legal precedence for concluding that the effort to remove Paxton from office violated the sanctity of elections because the voters had already forgiven him by reelecting him.
Right. And so this sort of raises this broader issue of, I'll just put this implies something, right? I mean, ultimately, when you say this implies that voters had in fact, learned about Paxton's legal problems, the some of the vast scope of them, all, who knows, right? I mean, it's kind of unclear, had, basically adjudicated them in their own minds, one way or another with whatever information they had. And nonetheless, or even because of their adjudication, decided that they should reelect him.
Right.
Okay.
And hence the term forgiveness, right? In other words, that this forgiveness doctrine. And, as we're saying, this is, there's a lot of legal underbrush one could unpack here. We get at some of it in the piece, and there's a lot about this in both motions, particularly in the House manager's response. So I would point you to that. And when we post this on our website, we'll post links to some of these documents, in addition to the blog post. Because, the House managers, as you might imagine, found many, many legal reasons why the whole notion, these notions of forgiveness or prior term were either irrelevant or non-applicable to Paxton's case, and all that stuff will be in the blog site. For the umpteenth time, we're not lawyers. Right. But, look, we have read a lot of logical arguments, and to me, the arguments seem pretty strong. If for no other reason, as you were pointing out earlier, that, taken to its logical conclusion in a lot of different ways, these doctrines would lead to kind of, absurd or even silly outcomes, right? Yeah,
I mean, you could imagine, if I'm someone who's looking like he's cruising to reelection, let's say, and the week before, my reelection or my first election, I mean, is that basically just like purge day? Yeah. Is it like, am I just allowed to do whatever? Because ultimately I'm going to be reelected, and assuming it happened before, my election, I'm okay. None of these are a problem. I should take all the bribes.
I'm just curious. I'm not calling you on this. I'm just curious, and I will fess up too. Yeah. How many of the Purge movies have you seen?
0.
Okay, I saw the first one. Yeah, it's a good use of it. So you've soaked it up right. But as you were mentioning, I'm like, wow, has Josh actually watched those Purge movies?
No, absolutely not.
That's something I imagine you watching.
No, you should. If nobody, there's nothing to update here. Not for me. Okay, but here's the thing. You may say to yourself, well, that's absurd. But courts actually look at this. They look at on the face of an argument. If it leads to an absurd outcome, that's actually something that judges often consider. And that's why I think, if you go back and look at the post that we did, and you did a really good job sort of digging up where the sort of prior term and forgiveness doctrines have come up. And if anything, the sort of, relevant examples of it really don't point to it being applied very broadly or at all.
No, that's right. I mean, and again, you guys can look that up, and, the lawyers in the audience.
But it raises an important point for at least for where we sit, right, which is that obviously, there's an intersection between this argument and public opinion, right? Because the underlying logic of this prior term and forgiveness argument hinges on this premise of an informed electorate, right? Or at least an electorate, sufficiently informed in terms of both whatever the breadth and depth necessary is to make like a substantive judgment about this candidate, in this case Paxton, in light of the alleged transgressions, right? So let's, we can just say, hey, does this depiction accurately describe the Texas electorate?
And in one of those moments that are good, I like to think of as, a podcast moment rather than a written moment. We started thinking about this in a very narrow sense, right? I mean, we saw they were making that argument. It's like, oh, well, even before they made these arguments, like, oh, we've been polling on this. We've got data about what the public knows. And then all of a sudden it became, almost, dispositive or, relevant to the arguments being made.
Right. So we've asked 4 times going back to 2016 and as recently as June of this year, how much voters had heard in the news about the legal problems of Attorney General Ken Paxton. That's it. We're not even saying, we're not looking for specifics. We're not even asking people, about, do you know about, have you heard of Nate Paul? Have you heard about his security fraud charges? Yeah. Have you heard? No, we're just saying, Have you heard about this in the news, right? Is this something that is, ringing a bell for you?
Have you heard the guy's problems?
And often, we ask this usually in the context of a bunch of other things too, just to kind of see, just in terms of things that are going on to see what people are paying attention to and what they're not. And that's sort of the question here is, are people paying attention to this? So prior to June 2023, because June 2023 comes after he was impeached, right? No more than 20% of Texas voters, so 1 in 5, said that they had heard a lot about Paxton's legal issues. After impeachment, it only went up to 31%. So first and foremost, there's no sense in the data that the public has really heard a lot about this, right? Because I know some people might say, especially if you're listening to this podcast, you're going to say, but this has been going on forever, surely. And it's like, this is where we let you know. Most voters are generally pretty uninformed. Sorry, it's just a fact. We ask what we do. There's a lot of ways we could go into this. We don't need to go into the details of this right now. We can do that on a different podcast. But generally speaking, most voters' knowledge of things is pretty surface level and does not include a lot of breadth, right? And this is just one of those things that really, has not penetrated the public, at least according to the data. So nearly half of voters in each survey prior to his impeachment said that they had heard either not very much or nothing at all. So we can say, again, the specific numbers don't really matter here, actually. I mean, the main point is about half of the electorate has consistently said they don't know anything about this. They haven't heard anything about it. It's not aware. So, I mean, just on its face, this idea of an informed electorate on this issue that's rendered judgment and forgiveness seems a little bit of a stretch.
Yeah, and in the way that people can, say, well, maybe you're saying this is half empty rather than half full. I mean, over time, more people did. Fewer people said that they had not heard a lot, but it was still a lot of people, right? I mean, in other words, if you go all the way back to October 2016, more than half, 55% said that they had heard not very much or nothing at all. Right. Now, that does go down, but 6 years later, right?
It's 42%.
To only 40, even to April, to 44 and then 42%. And, in October of 2022. So, yes, for the skeptics, it was soaking in some to more people, but not very much.
And I think October 22 is an important point here. That was the eve of the election. We think of that as our pre-election poll. So the idea, again, that, when voters were reelecting Ken Paxton, they knew about this. Well, I got to be honest, the data says no. Right. That is definitely, there's nothing here that supports that. The other problem, and there's more in the data that actually sort of counters this idea of an informed electorate, an electorate that had rendered, basically a positive judgment on Paxton despite this. So it also appears, looking at the data, that the more informed a voter was about Paxton's legal problems, all else equal, the more likely they are to say that the House was justified in impeaching Ken Paxton. So when we look at the June 2023 polls after impeachment, so we asked both how much they'd heard about his legal problems, and then later in the survey we asked, do you think the House was justified in impeaching him?
And even though this is obvious, it's worth, I think, underlining after the impeachment and after the election.
Right. So exactly. So again, still low levels of knowledge. But when we look at this, we find among people who said they have heard not very much about Paxton's legal problems, 29% thought the House was justified in impeaching him, 10% thought they weren't, 61% didn't have an opinion. Great. They shouldn't, right? They don't know about it. Again, to the point here, that's actually a big number. Although among those who said that they'd heard some about it, the share saying that the House was justified in impeaching him went from 29% to 52%. Among those who said they'd heard a lot, the share saying the impeachment was justified jumped to 74%. So again, a little bit of a problem here to say that, clearly voters know about this and they've forgiven him. Well, actually, voters don't know about it. And when voters do know, they actually thought the House was justified in impeaching him. Now, let's be fair, right? We could say, hey, look, this is just Democrats, right? This must just be Democrats using this. And this would be partially true in the sense that Democrats have been paying more attention to Ken Paxton's legal problems and have Republicans throughout. Now, take a step further in that argument, though, given that Democrats are not voting for Ken Paxton and the idea is that voters forgave Ken Paxton and then reelected him to office. Well, look, Ken Paxton's reelection to office relied predominantly on the votes of Republican voters. I don't think that's a controversial statement. And Republican voters were paying the least attention to this. Okay. At the same time, though, even among Paxton's core supporters, these Republicans, the poll found GOP voters were split on Paxton's impeachment. So overall, 31% thought the House was justified, 30% thought it wasn't justified. And this split held regardless of knowledge. So it wasn't as though the more informed Republican voters said, no, the impeachment wasn't justified. Among those who had heard some about Ken Paxton's legal problems, 34% thought the House was justified, 31% thought it was not justified. This is among Republicans. Among Republicans who say they had heard a lot, again, a minority of Republicans, about Ken Paxton's impeachment, 42% said it was justified, 47% said it was not justified. So at best, the best interpretation you can have is among Paxton's core supporters who returned him to office, most had not heard about his impeachment or has not heard about his legal problems. When asked about his impeachment, they were split on his justification. And even those who had heard a lot about it still split. So the underlying data here, there's a couple takeaways, right? So the first takeaway is, the data does not support this premise that the electorate was informed when reelecting Paxton. I think that's a full stop. And even now, most voters are just starting to pay attention.
Right.
Second, Republicans have not expressed forgiveness in the here and now, and in fact look to be, split down the middle, really, in their response to the House's impeachment. And the third takeaway is when voters do express awareness of Paxton's, alleged transgressions, they do appear all else equal, less likely to be forgiving at this point.
Right. So, it casts some doubt in two key dimensions on this notion of the forgiveness doctrine, right? Because, on one hand, as we've said, people didn't know that much.
Right.
And so, you get into the, uninformed forgiveness seems to be a kind of empty set concept in a lot of ways. And the more they know, the less likely they are to forgive. Controlling for party.
Yeah, and it's interesting, too, because I think, one of the things that struck me about when the House managers laid out the case for impeachment, especially in the committee, more so than on the floor, but one of the issues that they raised, there that's been less, I think, a part of the kind of the follow-on arguments and the motions and all that is, they pointed out the fact that, and again, if you've been following this, especially with respect to the securities fraud charges against Paxton, that these charges have been going on for, almost a decade now, or this case. And, that was by design in terms of the defense that Paxton had mounted. And, again, we're not going to go into this. Lauren would be a great person to bring back to, maybe you guys talked about this, but in terms of all the wrangling that went on about where the case should take place, who is getting paid what and how, and all of this essentially delayed adjudication of this, right? And, in some ways what the House, what the House managers said when they were laying this out is, look, to the extent that this has not been adjudicated by a court of law, the voters have not been given an opportunity to actually evaluate all of these issues. And if that's going to continue to go on, this is where we kind of have to step in. Because ultimately, in some ways they were almost saying, look, had Paxton just gone to trial on securities fraud and whatever happened, they convict him, they let him off, and then the voters go and reelect him, okay, fine, hands up, fair enough, right? But in this case, because, essentially of this sort of the legal strategy, which is very common of just delaying these things out and drawing them out and trying to bleed out the other side for as long as you can, actually, this has not been adjudicated in public. And one of the points I think is that, we made in the piece I think is important. And technically you're presumed innocent. I mean, Paxton in a real court of law, right? Not...
Well, a court of law, which this is not.
Yeah, but in an actual court of law where these securities fraud charges are going out, currently Ken Paxton is presumed innocent. But absent, sort of any actual case, adjudication of it, a decision by a judge or a jury or whoever is going to ultimately decide that, what essentially, Paxton's defense is saying is, even though nobody's actually adjudicated these issues in a serious sort of legal way in an actual criminal court or a civil court or whatever, we're saying that the voters have, in fact, actually adjudicated all of this in their minds, have come to a determination that Paxton is fine, and have voted him, into office. And both on the face of, what we know about what the public thinks, but also the actual processes that's played out over the last decade, it's kind of ridiculous. I mean,
look, the House managers have pointed out what seems pretty apparent on the face of it, that in the legal process, the idea, the whole purpose was, or, at least part of the, you don't even have to say purpose. One of the effects of the very common legal strategy of delay was to actually prevent the formation of an informed public. That was also part of the strategy of, the House managers will argue, and does seem to be, the point of much of the evidence that was, dumped last week, that a similar attempt in terms, from the perspective of thinking about what the electorate knows was made to prevent public knowledge of several aspects of his relationship with Nate Paul. And so, let the adversarial process take place. But from the perspective of public opinion, it actually really casts a lot of doubt on the whole construct that there was an informed electorate that was capable of, any kind of, I'm going to call it informed forgiveness, but the whole concept of forgiveness, I think, maybe we're even getting into the theological here, presupposes a certain level of knowledge of that which is being forgiven.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
And I think, if you think about
just to lay it out a little,
Yeah. And if you think about what really, I think kicked the House into gear on this in a lot of ways, it was when Paxton came to the House and asked for about $3.3 million to settle the whistleblower complaint. And ultimately, what the House said was, well, can you answer some questions about that? And Paxton said no. Well, I think they were, at that point, you're asking the House to basically write a blank check, almost, not a blank check, it's a $3.3 million check, to essentially make this problem go away for him.
Yeah.
And I think, at some point that becomes a big ask. And I've said this before, but also, with the FBI undergoing, an investigation, already having indicted Nate Paul, seemingly looking into, pretty seriously looking into what Paxton has been doing, I think there was probably a lot of reticence on the part of the House,
pretty clearly,
to be forgiving, but also, in some ways, I say this is tongue in cheek, but it's like you almost, are you a co-conspirator at that point? you're not actually probably, but you're sitting here writing him a check to essentially to forgive.
And by you mean
the Texans,
the members of the House's kind of view of themselves, and
and then ultimately they're sitting here essentially, aiding him in this process of not actually adjudicating these issues,
right?
Now,
which is, sort of part of how we got here. And there's, there are a lot, thrusts us back into the political, the very political dimension of some of that decision making. But, and as we, one of the things that was almost I'd like to say I thought of this ahead of time, but one of the kind of unexpected takeaways, or the kind of, this has moved my thinking about this a little bit, is that, heartened is too strong a word. But when I saw what the patterns were in public opinion, that as people became more informed, they were more skeptical. Including Republicans, even if at a lower baseline. We spend a lot of time in here talking about how partisanship, the current configure of partisanship with ideological sorting and polarization,
negative part,
strong, and negative polarization so strongly colors everybody's fundamental interpretations of what the stimuli they're getting from the world. In this sense, we'll see how we feel when the process plays out. But, I'm a little heartened that the public is, has some healthy skepticism, even if we can see that partisanship plays a role. Democrats are more inclined to think that it was justified. Republicans are less inclined. But the information is, thus far, has shaped public opinion. I think, maybe a little bit of a plug here, but, we'll obviously be doing more polling on this. Don't want to say where or when to poison the well. But it will be interesting to see if this little ray of optimism or positive affect I have, in this moment kind of carries forward.
It's funny because...
And I don't, and honestly, I don't know.
Yeah, I'm pretty... I hold a certain amount of skepticism here, and I think part of it is something I mentioned before about the asymmetry in the information environment. I think, the distance that we've had between the impeachment and what will eventually be the trial, sort of the tactical and totally understandable aggressiveness on the part of Paxton's defense to try to paint a picture of essentially, just funny enough, like a more or less corrupt House and an unfair process. They are going directly to voters with that. That is something that they're actively trying. This is a narrative that they're actively trying to seed. And it's going to be interesting to see how effective that is, because I think one of the other things that this, something that's really important here, I guess, and this is, let me take a step back. Let's put on that social science hat again for 1 second. This is where the lack of knowledge actually really plays to Paxton's benefit, potentially.
Yeah, because they have a degree of advantage in filling in the gaps.
Right. So the idea is when we think to yourself, okay, let's say you have an opinion on something. Well, first of all, you have to have an opinion, right? So let's just start there. So you have an opinion one way or the other about this. And the idea is the strength of that opinion might be a function of a number of things, but one of those things might be like how much you know about it, like how many considerations you bring to bear on that opinion. In this case, whether or not Paxton should be impeached, whether or not he should, remain in office, right? But if you have nothing,
right,
and let's say someone comes along who you trust, or you consistently hear the same message, or you hear a very persuasive message, even, right? Well, all of a sudden, if you think about it, if you've got a vessel that's got nothing in it, now that's what gets put in there. Well, there's nothing to counteract that, and that becomes essentially what you know. And I think in our sort of information environment, in our media environment, in the way that people seek out information, it wouldn't surprise me if some of the most committed Republicans in the next poll rally around Paxton, not even necessarily because I think, because they've taken a fair-minded adjudication of the facts, because honestly, that still is what we're actually waiting to have happen, right, in the trial. But waiting
to see if it will happen. Yeah.
But because, what they've heard is something that they got through, a campaign appeal, some kind of email from, some allied group.
Right.
Maybe some coverage they picked up of, Tony Busby on AM radio talking about, the kangaroo court, and that
reading from his
briefs, know. And so I think, we're at a little bit of an interesting kind of pregnant moment. I don't know what's going to happen next in terms of the way the post comes. And the thing is, I think it matters, because this is a political process, I think it matters pretty dramatically. I mean, the fact that, after the House impeached the Attorney General, we saw a split among Republicans, that completely and perfectly encapsulated sort of the discomfort among especially Senate Republicans in terms of how to move on this.
Right.
I mean, the gag order in some ways, look, on the one hand, we talked about this before, the gag order by the Lieutenant Governor, I think was, in some way a way to try to ostensibly show a process that's, fair.
Yeah.
It also provides a lot of cover because, most of the people involved in the process don't have to say anything about it right now.
Right.
And I don't think they want to, because there's no obvious sort of direction. There's no signal from their public, Republican voters,
right,
especially, committed Republicans as to where they're coming on Paxton. But if we go and, essentially Paxton and his allies have been successful in sort of messaging this, and this becomes the first thing that a lot of Republicans hear, because it will be the first thing a lot of Republicans hear about this, we come back and now it's 70-30, don't impeach, they shouldn't have impeached him. It's 80-20, he should stay in office or whatever. That's not the question, but something along those lines. That's going to put a lot of pressure on Senate Republicans.
I mean, I guess my point is I don't know.
I don't know either.
I don't know what it's going to look like. I mean, I don't want to say I don't want to overplay my optimism here. But, I would not have been surprised in our June poll had we asked about this and Republicans had been if we had already gotten those numbers that you were just talking about.
No, totally. Right. I mean, that's the thing. So that's kind of, from our seats, that's what I'm watching. That's what I want to see what happens, because I think that is really going to color the calculations that the people in the process are making, dramatically. And we're up to the point at which, that part of this game is over.
There's a little bit of the, we need to wind up soon. But I mean, I think one of the things that we're seeing, that's an interesting aspect of this, is that for all that we've talked in the last decade about the importance of factional conflict inside the Republican Party as a driver of politics in the state, in the context of, waning, put it mildly, Democratic influence in the public debate. This is a very big moment for sorting out this dynamic you were referring to from a political sciencey way of the fact that, Republican voters who are kind of in the driver's seat in the political system, they're experienced getting somewhat mixed messages from elite Republican leaders. But most of those divisions have been operative in the most potent ways, more in relatively limited mobilized circles. Like you talking about strong Republicans really was an interesting point as I thought about that. But, you know, this is going to be a very, very high visibility fight, really most among Republicans.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, the idea
And
is
how those signals sort themselves out is going to be very interesting, and whose signals, you know, wind up getting through more powerfully, you know, and interacting with predispositions about public corruption. And
yeah, and I mean, and the thing is, you know, when we talk about, you know, Republican coalitional, factional politics or whatever, usually we're talking more about how high the volume's got to be.
right.
Not different channels.
Yeah.
And this is just different, right? So the idea here is, you know, again, normally, you know, to the extent that, you know, just we talk about this all the time, but to the extent that sort of the far right, most committed, you know, grassroots, primary voters, however you want to describe them, Republicans, you know, to the extent that mobilizing those people against more center right, you know, tendencies in the Republican coalition has been one about degree. Well, they didn't do enough on abortion. They didn't do enough to, you know, secure gun rights. They didn't do enough to secure the border, but they were doing stuff all the time, right? This is different because we're talking about different directions, right? And that is going to be interesting to watch them navigate.
Yeah, there's not much in the way of middle ground here. And, you know, although, you know, I think I've thought that before on these things.
Yeah, that's right.
You know, I mean, to go back and, you know, this is where, you know, one of the gaps in terms of the elite signaling right now, that's a very interesting absence in all this, is the lack of signals from both the lieutenant governor and the governor.
Yeah.
And while I don't expect either of them to start sending super clear signals, there is going to, you know, one of the biggest questions we've been saying all along is, you know, how is the lieutenant governor going to handle this? What is his signaling going to be like? And I think we've got a lot of, you know, it's a whole other podcast to talk about what those signals look like. So those are one of the things that we're going to be looking at. But I would close by just urging people to go and look at the data. This is, you know, we're saying this all the time. The data on this is very interesting, and it will be a good baseline as we move forward and as the trial begins, as we do more polling, and we see, you know, where public opinion is going to move on this. So with that, thanks to Josh for being here. As always, thanks again to our excellent production team in the Dev Studio here in the College of Liberal Arts at UT Austin. Busy time for them with being back to school, so thanks for your, as always, great production support. Thanks for listening. You can find more of this data we're talking about at texaspolitics.utexas.edu. Follow the blog link and you'll find it. And we'll be back soon with another Second Reading podcast. The Second Reading Podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.